Well, thank you. And it's my great pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the organisers for this invitation. The Foreign Policy Centre and Justice for Journalists are doing something very important in gathering us together over the next 2 days, because this is a serious issue and unfortunately given limited attention. The assault on media freedom is something that should be a cause of serious worry to the free world, and I just wanted to explain why I'm here. As Maria's just said, I am a barrister, a member of the House of Lords, but I'm also the director of the International Bar Association Human Rights Institute, and I'm a member of the high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom. And you're going to ask yourself, well, what the devil is that? Who gets to say what is a high-level panel? And I should explain to you something about the history of this. The high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom is an independent body that was convened in July 2019. And it was done at the request of the UK and Canadian governments. And they had become with a bit of lobbying, it has to be said, become very concerned about the hugely increased assaults upon media freedom globally, and the increasing deaths of journalists, and not surprisingly the most numbers in areas of conflict, but actually journalists being taken out, and I don't have to document them to you. I myself was involved with the rapporteur on extrajudicial killing, Agnes Kalamar. I was brought in as the legal expert, and we went to Turkey to investigate the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, and heard the terrible tapes which really confirmed and showed what he experienced and the ways in which he was assassinated in that part of the embassy, the consulate of the Saudi Arabians in Istanbul. And so it was something to which we at the Institute of Human Rights of the International Bar Association were all too aware. And of course then in my own chambers, Doughty Street, a number of our leading lawyers were greatly involved in issues like the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia, and also Amal Clooney has been involved with Maria Ressa, with Cillian Gallagher and other lawyers, all of whom have got at the heart of their practices the protection of media freedom globally. And so this high-level panel of legal experts was set up to look at the ways in which we might be able to galvanize law and harness it to the protection of media freedom globally. And on that high-level panel is Irwin Kotler, who was the Attorney General in Canada, Hina Jilani, who was the head of the Pakistan Human Rights Commission, they're all practitioner lawyers with experience of being in the courts. Lord Neuberger, David Neuberger, who was the President of the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, Amal Clooney herself, Sarah Cleveland, a very distinguished media expert in the United States. We have an expert from India, from South Korea, from Lebanon, from Africa, and you'll hear about them in the course of these 2 days. Some of them have written very important reports for us and led the creation of reports about ways in which there should be reform. Now the panel, as I say, has this diverse group of leading lawyers from around the world, and the remit is to provide advice and recommendations to governments to prevent and reverse abuses of media freedom. We've already published a number of these reports, and a number are about to be published over the next few months. And we're really drawing to attention of governments the international obligations that they have relating to media freedom, and that they should be upheld and disseminated, and that there should be model legislation. And this is one of the areas around SLAPP where there should be legislation more widely disseminated that can be drawn on by governments to protect journalists. Because journalists undoubtedly are being targeted for their work. And Freedom House and other organisations have documented this, as indeed have we. The Secretariat for the International Bar Associations is the International Bar Association's Institute of Human Rights, and Zara Iqbal, who's here, is the sort of key lawyer who works in the Secretariat and leads that work. And so I just wanted to run down a number of the things that are going on. I mean, globally, attacks on journalists and the media have grown exponentially in the last few years, and it can't be separated from the fact that we've had a proliferation of populist governments, authoritarians who really do want to silence any kind of criticism. That rise of authoritarianism is contributing to the global assaults on media freedom and journalism, and it's not just directed at individual journalists, it's of course closing down the internet in places and all sorts. And COVID provided a level of cover for some of this stuff. Now, the freedom of the media and legitimate reporting by journalists is being undermined by governments around the way, even in, unfortunately, democratic states. We've got to just recognise that the fear of the truth speaks to the power of journalists, the power of media freedom, and the importance to fight those who stand in the front lines courageously exposing corruption of government, abuses of power, and human rights violations. And do bear in mind that COVID has been a very nice alibi for many of these things. I mean, we saw it with in Hungary with Orbán actually passing law that would limit anything that he said would, of course, interfere with government steps to develop policy. But the drafting of it showed that it was not limited to the high moment of making sure there was not fake news around COVID, but actually was much more widely drawn so that it put serious limits on journalism should the government not like it. Attacks on journalists and the media take many forms, and perpetrators often succeed in their aim to punish, to censor, and ultimately create a chilling effect on the profession. And that's one of the problems, is that because there are costs to media organizations, often the proprietors of newspapers and media outlets themselves stifle their journalists because of the fear of being closed down or of having litigation against them, which will be of huge cost. And we all know that. That's part of the experience of us as lawyers, that when you are taking on a case and you are the David to a Goliath, one of the things that the Goliath does is absolutely drown you in paper, drown you in arguments, and the litigation can go on for years, and the costs are piling up, and the risks to you of absolutely putting you out of operation and bankruptcy is very real. Now, the vital jobs of journalists is to report on matters of public interest and bring information into the public domain. But it results in serious attacks, and you know of this. Physical attacks, online smear, harassment campaigns, removal of press cards, devices are hacked. We have seen the theft and destruction of journalistic equipment, raiding their offices and taking of computers, and even attempts to block news websites and censor reporting. Now, you have convened a very important opportunity for discussion about one specific type of attack, the phenomenon that Maria has described to you, the phenomenon of strategic lawsuits against public participation. And those threats of legal actions against journalists about their sources and going after their sources or going after their news outlets often are used as a way to silence reporting. And the earliest that we've known of this to be drawn to public attention was in a piece of work by Professors George Pring and Penelope Keenan in their book SLAPP, Getting Sued for Speaking Out. It was published in the mid-90s. And generally, it refers to a lawsuit filed by powerful and wealthy subjects, corporations, public officials, high-profile business people against non-government individuals or organizations who express a critical position on a substantive issue of public interest or political interest, social significance. And we know it in this country because Robert Maxwell was the king of it, of taking libel suits against people and not least other news outlets. SLAPPs are not defined aspects of law themselves. Instead, they can be characterised by the manner in which a range of laws concerning typically defamation, but also other torts, and labour laws, and sometimes privacy laws and data protection law, a whole range of law is used by litigants to threaten parties into silence. And they either, what they're seeking is the retraction of published public interest reporting, or coercing a commitment not to publish in the first place. And these lawsuits are commonly used against journalists investigating government corruption, exposing corporate abuses. But they're also used against civil society organisations, NGOs, human rights defenders and activists to shut down or silence aspects of protest, and we've seen it with small law firms who act for NGOs in taking actions to protect. I remember it in relation to an indigenous group who were being who were receiving legal advice in a litigation against an oil company in the United States, and I remember it because I remember that Sting and his wife Trudy Styler were funding this litigation and helping this small legal outfit to do it. And basically what ended up happening was that the big oil company went after the lawyers and made all kinds of accusations and basically have driven them out of existence. But of course, the people who suffered at the end of the day were the indigenous peoples in, I think it was Ecuador, whose land had been despoiled, whose children were suffering medical consequences of some of the things that had been done by the big oil company. SLAPP lawsuits are often the targeted malicious action, and they're effective in playing the legal system on often baseless court cases, and they can take years to legally defend, and they're filed, of course, with the intention to intimidate. According to Media Defence, many of the journalists who are targeted with SLAPP litigation face heavy fines, or they're end up being banned from journalism, or they face custodial sentences as a result of baseless legal claims. So it's not just civil actions, often it will be about bringing criminal actions, and we've been reviewing that in the work that we've done with the high-level panel. So it's important to think of not just the financial impact of this, the time and energy and the way in which it distracts people from what they normally would do, but the psychological impact on journalists can be absolutely hellish. Collateral damage is the impact, of course, on their families and their personal life and so on. Now, I really think that this addresses one of the problems within our legal systems, which is the power imbalance that operates in it in any event, hidden under what was normally seen as due process. But it certainly has the impact of silencing important and vital journalism. So this discussion and these opportunities to exchange information lead eventually, for me, as someone who is both a lawyer but also involved in a part of Parliament where litigation is, where legislation is reviewed, and where there are opportunities also of bringing private members' bills and so on, is that we really do need to do what has been done in other jurisdictions, because in a survey there are now states in Canada and the United States where anti-SLAPP laws have been created, and we should be looking at those laws and looking at ways in which they can be introduced. There is a push for an anti-SLAPP directive in the European Union, but since we in the United Kingdom are no longer part of the European Union, we're going to have to go it alone and find a way of introducing such law. In a survey conducted last year by the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and it was a survey of 63 journalists reporting on financial crime and corruption in 41 countries. 3/4 of respondents reported that they'd received communications threatening legal action as a result of their work. Moreover, the UK was the leading source of these threats, with almost as many originating from here as from European Union countries and the United States combined. So just think about that. Companies based here in the UK being, threatening when they are being scrutinised. the UK anti-SLAPP working group is developing recommendations which could form the basis of anti-SLAPP law here. Now, as we're all here, the purpose of this is to engage people on this topic and to understand how we can best counter it in the United Kingdom and how the UK can support journalists elsewhere who are subject to legal intimidation. And SLAPP should be very much part of the global campaign on media freedom. And let me explain to you that there is a global campaign on media freedom because since that originating creation of the high-level legal panel, UNESCO has become the umbrella organization, and there are now 49 countries that have signed up to a pledge to protect media freedom in their own nations. And so we've now got a sort of, if you like, a body of nations that we can start pressing to consider any recommendations that might be made by us here. Now, I've mentioned this high-level panel. Many of our group experience the lengthy legal challenges presented by SLAPP in their daily practice, because they are all media lawyers from around the world. And they are representing clients who are journalists or media organisations affected by this issue. And I mean, for example, Amal Clooney, who's one of our number, who's sort of stepped off the high-level legal panel because she's in the middle of a big case that we're all looking at, which is the Maria Ressa case. And you know, of course, that Maria has now become a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. She's just been awarded the Nobel Prize. But Maria has had, you know, litigation and prosecution thrown at her time after time after again. As Amal said recently, 1 down and 8 to go. And Amal Clooney and Keelan Gallagher in my chambers are both acting for Maria Ressa. And so we are really trying to look at this and look at the ways in which it impacts on journalists. And we've got to sort of look at the way in which this is happening all around the world, and in some places in the most egregious forms. In the Philippines, journalists have been killed, journalists and the lawyers who act for them. I mean, in fact, in recent times there's been a horrible spate of the killing of lawyers. This stuff happens to people who are journalists, but it also happens, of course, to human rights lawyers, and it happens to people who are involved in human rights work and so on around the world. Now, this should be an alarming trend to all of us, and to key stakeholders. And so we're really hoping that you will join with other organisations, including our own and the panel, to try and develop ways of addressing the way in which law is being harnessed in order to attack independent journalism. And we've got to really take apart some of those things that are used. You know, sometimes it's lèse majesté. In places like Thailand, it's, you know, you insulted the king or the royal family or something. And it's not dissimilar in other places too in the Middle East. The insult is considered a criminal offence, and they go after journalists who actually are reporting corruption. And so we should be really mindful of all these ways in which journalists are under threat. Tomorrow you're going to hear from a wonderful colleague on the high-level legal panel. He's a South African defamation lawyer, Dario Milo, who's one of the authors of the high-level panel's report on the ways in which law is used to silence journalism. So those were the matters I wanted to raise with you as you start this important conference, and to say that you know, without media freedom, you know, it is one of those fundamental pillars, you know, along with the rule of law, along with parliamentary sovereignty. Those things are fundamental to free societies, and without it, and with its diminishment, we live in less good places. And so our voices have to be heard on this subject, and there has to be law reform. Thank you.